Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good.
Are you from Cuba?
I am.
Why did you come to America?
Mostly I came to America because of Fidel Castro. I didn't like him as a leader. In 1966 I came to America because that's when we were allowed to enter the United States. And we mostly came to Florida because it's so close to Cuba. It's 90 miles from the closest point. And most of my friends that came with me didn't like Castro's communist regime, so that's why we came back. And we were loyalists of Batista, and that's why we fled when Castro came to power. And Castro tried to stop people from leaving, but we sneaked out.
What contributions have you made to the American culture?
From food and drink is probably the most notable that people will see. Arroz con pollo, chicken and rice, originated in Cuba, as long as the Cuban sandwich and the steak sandwich are all notable Cuban food.
What are some notable figures?
Fidel Castro is our main leader. He was a communist leader since 1959. He overthrew Batista and he ruled for over 50 years. He did some good things, but he's overall criticized, and he didn't have a very good relationship with the United States. And he also had a trade embargo with the United States, so we couldn't trade with the United States.
What are some initial challenges that you faced when you came to America?
Well, there's always the physical challenge of moving and migrating to Miami. They always traveled by sea, and that caused many deaths because it was extremely dangerous. There was 3 waves that they went through for immigration. There was one that was pre-1959, and there was a late 1880s, and then a 1959 to 1973. The upheaval of Cuban migration to Miami actually caused African-American rioting in the 1980s, and it was the worst rioting since the 1960s. There's always the isolation, which means that the culture is not dominant, so you always have to learn new things. In Miami, they actually got angry at the Cubans for trying to use their language because they didn't want the Spanish to overcome their language. They're also unaware of the U.S. culture, which was also an initial challenge that they faced.
How did U.S. assimilate Cuba?
Well, American culture is already basically influenced by the Cuban, so it wasn't too hard for them. Both influenced each other. In the 1980s, they had moved to the suburbs of Miami, and then the Cubans eventually lived in all of the 50 states. They were successful in establishing businesses and then modernizing places in Miami, such as like the beaches, by adding a Caribbean flavor. 25% of the businesses in Miami were Cuban-owned, and then the Cuban-American assimilation was dependent on the period of migration. There was 1950s, 60s, 70s, and the 1950s and 60s and 70s were the Cubans that were rich, so they assimilated easily because of their high education. They could get jobs easily, and the rest after that they didn't assimilate very easily.
What's everyday life like for you being Cuban?
Well, it's a lot different from being in the homeland, but I try to adapt American culture with Cuban culture, try to keep it authentic while also bringing in some of the American ways that I've learned since I've migrated here.
What's some Cuban history? What can you tell us about that?
Well, one big thing that involved the United States was obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was basically a long-range missile aimed for the Western Hemisphere, and this all happened during John F. Kennedy's
Presidency?
Yeah, presidency. And the Soviet Union partnered with Cuba. Nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles were built and aimed towards America, and U.S. spy planes discovered the Soviet missile bases in Cuba. The naval quarantine of Cuba, we quarantined Cuba navally because we knew that they had missiles pointed at the United States, and then it officially began on October 15th in 1962. And during the next 6 days, the crisis escalated to a breaking point as citizens waited on the brink of nuclear war between the 2 superpowers, and Cuba emerged with a greater sense of security. And then, as you mentioned before, the Embargo Act, which was a commercial, economic, and financial act against Cuba, and it happened in October 1960, and basically nothing was allowed to be shipped between the two countries.
Cool. Yeah, well, nice to see you guys. I'll see you again
Yeah,
soon.
definitely.